3 months ago, my heart stopped beating for exactly 1 minute and 43 seconds. The doctors called my parents and told them I might not survive the night. My father thanked them for calling, then asked if they could keep her comfortable until tomorrow, because my little brother was swimming the biggest race of his life that afternoon. By the time my heart started beating again, my parents were standing beside an Olympic-sized pool, cheering, smiling, recording videos. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 26 years old. When I woke up in the intensive care unit, every breath felt like sandpaper scraping through my chest. Machines surrounded my bed. My throat burned. My body barely felt like mine. The first thing I whispered wasn't, "Am I going to be okay?" It wasn't, "What happened?" I asked the question almost every daughter would ask. "Did my family make it?" The nurse looked toward the empty chair beside my bed, then back at me. "I'm sorry, no one came." For a long moment, I simply stared at the ceiling. Not because I couldn't believe it, because some part of me realized this wasn't the first time they'd chosen my brother over me. It was only the first time they'd done it while I was dying. The next morning, my phone finally buzzed. Not with panic, not with relief. A voicemail. I pressed play. Dad sounded calm, almost cheerful. "Claire? We heard from the hospital. The doctors say you're stable now. Ethan only gets one shot at qualifying. We'll come tomorrow. You've always been the strong one. I know you'll understand." I listened to that message 7 times, not because I thought I'd misunderstood, because I kept waiting to hear something that never came. Fear, urgency, love, anything. There was nothing, just tomorrow. That word followed me for 26 years. Tomorrow. Tomorrow we'd celebrate. Tomorrow they'd show up. Tomorrow we'd talk. Tomorrow never came. While I was lying alone in room 614, my mother posted 3 photographs on Instagram. Ethan standing on the starting block. Ethan holding his silver medal. Both of my parents smiling beside him beneath a banner that read, "Road to the Olympic Trials." Her caption said, "Nothing is more important than believing in your child." Hundreds of people clicked like. None of them knew their daughter was still attached to heart monitors less than 20 miles away. I could have spent those 7 days wondering why. Instead, I started asking a different question. What if this hadn't started at the hospital? What if I'd been missing the truth my entire life? So I asked for everything. Visitor logs, medical records, old bank statements, forgotten emails, anything that could explain why the people who raised me never came. Each answer uncovered another lie. Each lie led to another secret. Until one afternoon, a lawyer placed a wooden box in front of me. Inside was a letter my grandmother had written before she died. It began with one sentence. "If you're reading this, they never told you the truth." That was the moment I realized. Surviving cardiac arrest wasn't the hardest thing I'd ever done. The hardest part was discovering that my parents hadn't forgotten me. They had spent 26 years quietly teaching the world to forget me too. People like to believe favoritism announces itself with grand gestures. It doesn't. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, one small decision at a time, one forgotten promise, one empty chair, one sentence repeated so often that everyone eventually mistakes it for the truth. In my family, that sentence was always the same. "Claire's fine. She never asks for much. She's the easy one." By the time I turned 26, those words had become less of a compliment and more of an excuse. I was 6 when I first realized our house revolved around Ethan. Not because anyone said it, because everything in our living room pointed toward him. Swimming trophies lined the fireplace. Blue ribbons hung above the television. Framed newspaper clippings covered an entire wall. Every few months, another photograph replaced an older one. Ethan at his first swim meet. Ethan shaking hands with a coach. Ethan smiling beside a medal almost too large for his neck. There were pictures of me too. 3, one from kindergarten. One Christmas portrait. One family photo where I stood at the very edge, half hidden behind my mother's shoulder. Even at 6 years old, I noticed the difference. Children always do. They just don't have the words for it yet. One December afternoon, I wandered into the living room while Mom was rearranging the picture wall. She stepped back to admire it. "What do you think?" she asked. "It looks nice," I said. Then I pointed toward the family picture. Can that one go in the middle? She smiled without looking at me. Oh, sweetheart, the middle is for Ethan's state championship. She said it so casually, as if there couldn't possibly be another answer. I nodded. Okay. That became my favorite word. Okay. Because children learn very early. That disappointment is easier to carry when nobody notices it. A week later, Grandma Margaret came over for Christmas dinner. She stood in front of the photo wall for a long time. Then she counted quietly. 1, 2, 3. She looked at me, then back at my parents. Richard, Linda, why are there only 3 pictures of Claire? The room became strangely quiet. Dad laughed first. She's not really into photos. Grandma looked at me. Is that true, sweetheart? I opened my mouth. Before I could answer, Mom spoke. Claire never cares about these things. I remember glancing toward the wall again. I did care. I just didn't think anyone cared that I cared. Grandma didn't argue. She simply reached into her purse, pulled out a small instant photograph she'd taken of me helping her bake cookies that morning. She walked over to the wall, found an empty space, and hung it there herself. There, she said with a smile. Now it looks more like a family. Dad removed it the next morning. He said the frame didn't match. When Ethan was 10, swimming became more than a hobby. Coaches started visiting. Newspapers called. College scouts were already whispering about potential. The whole house changed. Weekends disappeared into swim meets. Vacations became training camps. Dinner conversations revolved around split times, rankings, and qualifying standards. If Ethan won, we celebrated. If Ethan lost, everyone walked on eggshells for days. Without realizing it, I began organizing my own life around his emotions too. One Friday afternoon, my elementary school announced an art exhibition. Every student would have one piece displayed. Parents were invited. I spent 2 weeks painting a rainy Seattle street with Grandma. She showed me how reflections danced across wet sidewalks after a storm. It's beautiful, she whispered. People always forget puddles can hold the sky. I didn't fully understand what she meant. I only knew I wanted Mom and Dad to see it. That morning, I handed Mom the invitation before she left for work. She kissed the top of my head. We'll be there. I believed her. The exhibition started at 5. 5 o'clock came. Then 5:15. Then 5:30. Parents filled the classroom. Children dragged mothers and fathers from painting to painting. Every few minutes I looked toward the door. My teacher knelt beside me. I'm sure they're just running late. At 6 o'clock, Grandma arrived, alone. She smiled the moment she saw me, but I noticed something else first. She wasn't carrying Dad's coat or Mom's purse. They couldn't come, I asked. Grandma hesitated, only for a second. Ethan had an extra training session, I nodded. Okay. That word again, always okay. Grandma studied my face for a long moment, then she took my hand. Show me the painting. We stood in front of it together. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, she smiled. You painted the reflections, I shrugged. I liked how the puddles looked. She squeezed my hand gently. No, you painted the people who never looked down. Years later, I would realize she wasn't talking about the painting anymore. That night, after Grandma drove me home, I walked past the kitchen. Mom and Dad were talking softly. They didn't know I was there. Dad sounded relieved. I'm glad Claire understands. Mom didn't answer immediately. There was a pause. Long enough for me to stop walking. I know, she finally whispered. Her voice faded. Dad interrupted. Linda, Ethan has a real chance. Claire will be fine. Another silence. Then Mom quietly said the words I'd hear for the next 20 years. She always is. I stood in the hallway, waiting for someone to come looking for me. No one did, looking back now. People often ask me when my parents stopped choosing me. They assume there must have been one terrible day. One life-changing decision. One unforgettable betrayal. They're wrong. Love rarely disappears all at once. Sometimes, it leaves so slowly that you don't realize you're standing alone until years later, and by then, everyone around you has already accepted the story. Claire is fine. Claire understands. Claire doesn't need anything, including her family. People think betrayal begins with a single unforgettable moment, a slammed door, a cruel sentence, a parent saying they don't love you. I used to think that too. But the truth is, Betrayal is usually much quieter. It's made of birthdays remembered too late, promises broken so often they stop sounding like promises, and little girls who slowly teach themselves not to hope. By the time I entered high school, I'd become remarkably good at asking for nothing. It wasn't because I didn't want anything. I simply understood the rules. If Ethan needed new racing suits, we found the money. If his coach recommended a training camp across the country, my parents somehow made it happen. If I needed something, I waited until it became impossible to ignore. Even then, I usually found another solution first. Looking back, I wasn't independent. I was adapting. There's a difference. I got my first job at 15. Not because my parents told me to. Because I was tired of hearing the phrase, "We'll see." "We'll see" usually meant no. It just sounded kinder. So I started babysitting for families in our neighborhood, then tutoring younger students after school. By 16, I worked weekends at a small bookstore near Pike Place Market. The owner, Mrs. Hernandez, used to laugh every time I picked up an extra shift. "You saving for something special?" I smiled. "College." She nodded approvingly. "Your parents must be proud." For a second, I almost corrected her. Instead, I smiled again. "They're busy." That answer became easier than telling the truth. Ethan was 17 when colleges really started calling. Scouts filled the bleachers during his swim meets. Recruiters shook my father's hand like he was signing professional contracts. Every conversation at home became about scholarship offers, training schedules, nutrition plans, travel expenses. I wasn't jealous. I was genuinely proud of him. He worked harder than anyone I knew. He woke before sunrise, practiced until his shoulders were raw, missed birthdays, skipped vacations. He earned every medal hanging on our wall. The problem wasn't Ethan. It never had been. The problem was that my parents acted as though only one dream could matter at a time. One Saturday morning, Ethan found me studying at the kitchen table. "You coming to the meet today?" he asked. "I have to work." He looked disappointed. "You've missed the last two." "I know, I'll try next weekend." He hesitated before speaking again. "Mom said you're working a lot lately." "I am." "You don't have to buy me anything for my birthday." I blinked. "What?" He shrugged awkwardly. "I heard Mom telling Dad money's tight. I don't want you spending yours on me." For a moment, I couldn't speak. He thought I was working to buy him birthday presents. He had no idea I was trying to pay my own tuition application fees. I smiled anyway. "Don't worry about me," he grinned. "You always say that." Then he grabbed his swim bag and hurried toward the door. "Wish me luck." "I always do." He waved without turning around. "I know." The front door closed. I sat there for another minute, staring at my textbooks. It wasn't Ethan's fault he didn't know. Children believe the version of reality they're given, just like I once had. Senior year arrived faster than I expected. I was accepted into the University of Washington's speech pathology program. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday. I must have read it 20 times before I finally believed it. That evening, I placed the acceptance letter on the kitchen counter. Dad glanced at it while scrolling through emails. "That's great." He didn't look up. Mom smiled from across the room. "We're proud of you." She meant it. I honestly believe she did. But before another word could be said, Dad's phone rang. He answered immediately. Within seconds, his entire face lit up. "Ethan? Really? When?" He laughed loudly. After hanging up, he turned toward Mom. "Coach says Stanford wants another meeting." She gasped. "Oh my goodness." They hugged each other in the middle of the kitchen. My acceptance letter remained exactly where I'd left it. No one picked it up again. A week later, Grandma Margaret invited me to lunch. She already knew. She always knew. "I'm proud of you," she said, before I even sat down. "You worked for this." I smiled. "So did Ethan." She stirred her tea quietly. "Yes, but only one of you had to convince yourself you didn't deserve applause." I looked away. "I don't need applause." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That's exactly what worries me." Graduation arrived on one of those perfect Seattle mornings that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Students laughed. Parents filled the stadium. Teachers rushed everywhere trying to organize rows. I kept searching the crowd until I finally spotted my parents. Relief washed over me. They came. For a moment, I let myself believe today might be different. Then Dad checked his watch. Again and again. Mom leaned toward him. He whispered something I couldn't hear. She looked toward the parking lot, not the stage. When the ceremony finally began, they stayed through the opening speeches. The principal had just started announcing academic awards when Dad quietly stood. Mom followed. Neither of them looked toward the stage. I watched them disappear through the exit gates together. At first, I assumed they'd be back. Maybe coffee, maybe a phone call. Maybe one of Ethan's coaches needed something. I kept looking toward the entrance. They never returned. After the ceremony, families crowded the football field. Flowers, balloons, laughter, camera flashes. Parents wrapped their arms around sons and daughters who had spent years reaching this moment. I stood alone, still wearing my graduation gown. Eventually, Grandma found me. She was carrying a bouquet of white lilies. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I tried to smile. They had to leave. She looked directly into my eyes. No, they chose to. Those 6 words hit harder than anything I'd ever heard. Because for the first time, someone said out loud what I had spent years trying to explain away. That evening, I checked social media. There they were, Mom, Dad, Ethan, standing beside an indoor pool. All 3 were smiling. The caption read, "So proud of another amazing performance." The timestamp matched almost exactly with the moment my diploma had been placed in my hands. I stared at the photo for a long time, then I quietly closed the app. Not because it hurt anymore, because something inside me had finally grown tired of making excuses for people who never asked to be forgiven. It would still take years before I stopped loving them, but that night, I stopped expecting them. People often ask me if I remember the day my heart gave out. I do. Not because of the pain, but because it was one of the few days in my life when my body finally admitted what my heart had been carrying for years. After graduation, life became exactly what I'd planned. Quiet, busy, predictable. I finished college with honors, earned my certification as a pediatric speech therapist, and found a position at Seattle Children's Hospital. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the kind of career that made headlines. But every time a child spoke their first clear sentence, every time anxious parents cried happy tears, I remembered why I'd chosen it. Helping children find their voices felt strangely personal. I'd spent most of my own life learning what happened when no one heard yours. By 26, I had settled into a routine that looked stable from the outside. I rented a small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. Nothing fancy, just enough space for a bookshelf, an old piano I'd bought secondhand, and a balcony where I drank coffee before sunrise. My coworkers became the family I never expected to find. Maria from occupational therapy never let anyone eat lunch alone. James, one of our nurses, remembered every birthday without writing them down. Even Dr. Patel, who rarely smiled, somehow knew exactly when someone needed encouragement. It surprised me how ordinary kindness could feel extraordinary, maybe because I'd spent so many years living without it. Home was different. Home still revolved around Ethan. His competitions had grown larger: national rankings, corporate sponsors, interviews, Olympic trials. Whenever my parents called, the conversations followed the same familiar pattern. "Did you see Ethan's race? You should watch the interview. The Olympic Committee is paying attention now." Sometimes they asked about work, usually after 10 minutes of talking about him. "Everything good with you?" "Yeah, good." Then they'd move on. I stopped taking it personally. At least, I told myself I had. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan called unexpectedly. "Hey, Claire." His voice sounded exhausted. "You free?" "For you?" "Always," he laughed. "I've got a day off. Want to grab lunch?" I smiled before I realized I was smiling. I'd like that. For nearly 2 hours, we talked about everything except swimming. He asked about my patients. I asked about life outside the pool. He admitted he hadn't had an entire weekend to himself in almost a year. "I don't even know what people my age do for fun anymore," he joked. When the check arrived, I reached for it. He beat me to it. "My turn. You've paid enough for me over the years." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked confused. "You know, the birthday presents, the extra stuff. I always figured you spent half your paycheck on me." For a moment, I just stared at him. He genuinely believed I'd been helping because I wanted to spoil him, not because I had been paying my own way through life. I smiled softly. "You've always believed the best about people." He shrugged. "I learned that from you." The words stayed with me long after lunch ended. A few weeks later, Grandma Margaret invited me to the lake cabin. It sat 2 hours outside Seattle, tucked between towering pines and quiet water. It had always been my favorite place. No trophies, no photographs celebrating championships, no constant comparisons. Just the smell of cedar wood and fresh coffee. Grandma seemed more tired than usual. She moved slower, paused more often. As we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she reached into her sweater pocket and handed me an old brass key. "Keep this," I frowned. "What does it open?" She smiled. "You'll know when the time comes." I laughed. "That sounds mysterious." "It is." Then her smile faded. "Promise me something." "What?" "No matter what anyone tells you, never doubt what you've lived." I looked at her curiously. "Why would I?" She stared across the lake for a long time before answering. "Because sometimes, the people closest to us work the hardest to rewrite our memories." At the time, I thought she was talking about aging. I had no idea she was trying to warn me. 3 months later, everything changed. It started like any other Tuesday. Morning rounds, patient evaluations, coffee that had gone cold before I finished half the cup. Around noon, a sharp pressure settled in the center of my chest. Not painful, just strange. James noticed before I did. "You okay?" "Yeah, I think I skipped breakfast." He narrowed his eyes. "You never skip breakfast." "I'll be fine." Those words again, the same words I'd heard my entire life. "I'll be fine." By 2 o'clock, the pressure had become pain. It spread into my shoulder, then my jaw. The hallway outside the therapy room suddenly tilted beneath my feet. Someone called my name. Another voice shouted for a crash cart. I remember grabbing the wall, missing it. The floor rushed toward me, then nothing. They told me later that my heart stopped for 1 minute and 43 seconds. A nurse began CPR immediately. The emergency team arrived within moments. Someone shocked my heart. Once, twice. The third attempt brought me back. I don't remember any of it. What I remember is waking up. The room felt impossibly bright. Every breath hurt. Machines beeped steadily beside my bed. A tube scratched my throat. The air smelled of antiseptic and plastic. For several seconds, I couldn't understand where I was. Then memories came rushing back. The hallway, the pain, falling. A nurse noticed my eyes opening. She smiled with visible relief. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare." My lips barely moved. She leaned closer. "My family." She looked toward the empty chair beside my bed, then back at me. "They were notified." I waited. She didn't continue. "Did they come?" The silence answered before she did. "I'm sorry, no." I turned my head toward the window. Rain slid slowly down the glass. Seattle looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Only my world had changed. I wasn't angry, not yet, mostly. I felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that part of me had still believed this might be different, that almost dying would finally matter enough. The next morning, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. One voicemail from Dad. I already knew what it would say. Still, I pressed play. "Claire, we heard you're stable. That's wonderful news. Ethan's qualifying event is today. We're going to stay until it's over. We'll come tomorrow, you understand?" The message ended. No, I love you. No, we're on our way. No panic, just certainty. The quiet certainty that I would wait, like I always had. An hour later, Maria walked into my room carrying a small paper bag. "I brought your favorite blueberry muffins." She stopped when she saw my face. "What happened?" Without saying a word, I handed her my phone. She listened, then listened again. When she finished, she slowly placed the phone on the blanket. "I don't know your parents," she said, carefully, "but I know this. If one of my children almost died, I'd be running through walls to get here." Something inside me cracked, not because she criticized them, but because she described something I'd never actually experienced. That afternoon, I opened Instagram. My mother's newest post filled the screen. Ethan standing on the podium, silver medal around his neck, Dad clapping proudly beside him. The caption read, "Some moments are simply too important to miss." I stared at those words until the screen dimmed. Then I quietly locked my phone. For the first time, I stopped asking why they hadn't come. Instead, I started wondering something far more dangerous. What if this wasn't an exception? What if it was proof of who they'd always been? The hardest part wasn't accepting that my parents had chosen Ethan. I'd already known that. The hardest part was realizing they had built an entire version of our family's history that depended on me believing in was normal. Once that illusion cracked, I couldn't stop seeing the pieces. I spent 7 days in the hospital. The doctors told me stress hadn't caused my heart condition, but it certainly hadn't helped. "You need rest," Dr. Patel said before signing my discharge papers. "No major decisions, no unnecessary pressure." I nodded politely, then walked straight into the biggest decision of my life. Because while everyone else thought I was recovering, I had started asking questions I'd avoided for more than 20 years. Questions no one in my family had ever wanted me to ask. It began with something small, almost insignificant. James handed me a paper envelope as I was leaving the hospital. This was dropped off yesterday. No name. Inside was a single handwritten note. It wasn't threatening or dramatic. It contained only one sentence. "Ask Margaret's lawyer what really happened after the funeral." No signature, nothing else. I turned the paper over twice. Blank. "Any idea who brought it?" I asked. James shook his head. "An older gentleman, didn't leave a name." I should have thrown it away. Instead, I drove home thinking about my grandmother. Margaret Ellis had passed away almost 18 months earlier. Officially, it had been peaceful, natural causes, a quiet funeral attended by family and a few lifelong friends. I remembered standing beside her casket while my father handled the paperwork. My mother comforted guests, and Ethan had arrived late from a training camp. Everything had looked normal. Now I wasn't so sure. 2 days later, curiosity won. I called the attorney whose business card I still kept inside one of Grandma's cookbooks, Richard Lawson. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Lawson, this is Claire Donovan." There was a long pause. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strangely relieved. "I've been hoping you'd call someday." That sentence immediately put me on edge. "You've been expecting me." "In a way, would you be willing to meet?" His office overlooked Elliott Bay. Nothing luxurious, old wooden shelves, family photographs, boxes of legal files stacked neatly against one wall. Richard looked to be in his late 60s. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that inspired quiet confidence. After we exchanged greetings, he studied me carefully. "You look exactly like your grandmother." "I've heard that before." "I'm glad, so did she." He folded his hands. "Tell me why you're here." I placed the anonymous note on his desk. He read it once, then slowly leaned back in his chair. I wondered if someone would eventually send this. "You know who wrote it?" "No, but I know why." For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard opened a drawer and removed a thick manila envelope. He didn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, he asked one question. "Claire, how much do you know about your grandmother's estate?" I shrugged. "Very little. She left everything to my father. That's what I was told." Richard held my gaze. "No, that is not what she instructed me to do." Every sound in the office seemed to disappear. I heard only the ticking of the clock behind him. "I'm sorry." "What?" He slid a single document across the desk, a copy of Grandma's signed will. My eyes moved across the page, then stopped. I read the paragraph again, and again. I was listed by name, not my father, not Ethan, me. I looked up. "This has to be a mistake." Richard quietly shook his head. "It isn't. Your grandmother amended her will 6 months before she passed away. She left the lake cabin to you." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because nothing else made sense. "That's impossible. My parents would have told me." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the envelope and placed a second document beside the first, a property transfer form. Then a third, a notarized authorization. Something immediately caught my eye, my signature, except it wasn't mine. I knew that before I'd even finished reading my own name. My hands started trembling. "I never signed this." "I know," Richard's voice remained calm. "I suspected as much." "You suspected. I couldn't prove it, not then." He opened another folder. "This is why I kept copies." Inside was a report prepared months earlier by an independent handwriting examiner. One sentence stood out. The question signature is inconsistent with verified samples belonging to Claire Donovan. I stared at the page, unable to breathe. They forged my name. Richard didn't answer directly. I can only tell you what the evidence suggests. But yes, it appears someone signed on your behalf. My first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief. My father balanced every checkbook to the penny. My mother returned library books before they were due. These weren't careless people. They respected rules. They taught me to respect rules. So how could the same people who insisted I never cheat on a spelling test sign my name to legal documents? Richard seemed to understand what I was thinking. The hardest lies are the ones told by people we've trusted all our lives. He reached beneath his desk and placed a small cedar box in front of me. I recognized it instantly. It had sat for years on a shelf in Grandma's cabin. I found this after the estate was settled, he said quietly. Your grandmother instructed me to give it to you, but only if I believed the truth had been kept from you. The brass key. Without saying a word, I reached into my purse and pulled it out. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Inside were 6 sealed envelopes, one for every birthday Grandma had missed after her death. Richard smiled sadly. She wanted to keep talking to you. I opened the first envelope with shaking hands. Grandma's handwriting filled the page. Strong, steady, unmistakably hers. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then something happened exactly as I feared. You have always been told you're the strong one. Please don't let anyone convince you that being easy to overlook means you were less loved. My vision blurred. A tear landed on the paper, then another. Richard quietly looked away, giving me the privacy my own family never had. At the bottom of the letter, one final sentence waited for me. The truth has a way of surviving, even when people spend years trying to bury it. For the first time, I understood that my grandmother hadn't simply left me a cabin. She had left me a way back to the truth. And once I knew the truth, there was no going back. For weeks after meeting Richard, I barely slept. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I kept hoping there had to be another explanation. One that didn't end with my parents deliberately stealing from me. One that didn't force me to choose between protecting my family and protecting the truth. Every morning, I opened Grandma's letters. Every night, I closed them wondering if exposing everything would destroy what little remained of us. Then Richard called. They've announced the date, the scholarship ceremony, Friday, 3 o'clock, Seattle Convention Center. My father would receive a Community Leadership Award for his unwavering dedication to developing young athletes. My mother had been invited to speak about family sacrifice. Ethan would officially accept one of the largest Olympic development scholarships in the state. The irony was almost unbearable, a family being honored for values they had never shown their own daughter. I don't have to do this, I whispered. Richard looked at me across his desk. No, you don't. His answer surprised me. I thought you'd tell me I had a responsibility. I think you have a choice. There's a difference. He slid the lawsuit toward me. If you walk away today, I'll respect it. If you file, there's no putting this back in the box. I stared at the papers for a long time. Then I remembered lying alone in room 614, waiting, listening for footsteps that never came. I picked up the pen. I'm done waiting. Friday arrived bright and unusually warm for Seattle. The ballroom buzzed with reporters, sponsors, coaches, former athletes, and local officials. Large banners hung from the ceiling, celebrating excellence, celebrating family. Volunteers hurried between tables, placing name cards. Television crews adjusted lights. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Everything looked perfect, perfect enough to hide almost anything. Richard stood beside me near the back entrance. You still have time to leave. I smiled sadly. I spent 26 years leaving. I think I'll stay. The ceremony began with applause. Videos played across massive screens. Families hugging, children crossing finish lines, parents crying in the stands. The audience laughed, clapped, wiped away tears. Then my family's video appeared. Ethan learning to swim, Dad timing laps with a stopwatch, Mom wrapping a towel around his shoulders after practice. A narrator spoke warmly. Behind every extraordinary athlete stands an extraordinary family. The room erupted into applause. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at the empty chair beside me instead. For some reason, It reminded me of the chair next to my hospital bed. Still empty, still waiting for people who had chosen somewhere else. The master of ceremonies smiled toward the front row. And now, please welcome this year's Olympic Development Scholarship recipient, Ethan Donovan. The applause was deafening. Ethan walked onto the stage, confident, grateful, completely unaware that his entire life was about to change. He adjusted the microphone. I've been asked what it takes to chase a dream like this. He smiled toward our parents. My answer has always been the same. You need people who never stop believing in you. More applause. My parents sacrificed everything. They taught me that family always shows up. I closed my eyes, not because I was angry, but because somewhere inside me, I wish those words had been true. The ceremony continued. Dad accepted his award. Mom smiled through tears. Reporters took photographs. Sponsors shook hands. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Until a man in a dark suit walked calmly down the center aisle. He carried a single sealed envelope. No one paid attention at first. They assumed he was another event coordinator. He stopped directly in front of my parents. Richard Donovan, Dad smiled politely. Yes. The man held out the envelope. You've been served. The smile disappeared. I'm sorry? Civil complaint, he spoke clearly enough for the people nearby to hear. Fraud, forgery, financial misappropriation. The room fell silent. Dad didn't take the papers. You have the wrong person. I don't. The process server gently placed the documents into his hands. Service is complete. Then he turned and walked away. He never raised his voice, never created a scene. He didn't have to. The paperwork had done it for him. Whispers spread through the ballroom. What happened? Did he say fraud? Who's suing them? Several reporters lowered their cameras from the stage and pointed them toward the front row instead. One producer spoke urgently into her headset. Stay live, don't cut. The Scholarship Foundation's director walked toward Richard. Richard quietly handed him a copy of the forensic report. The man scanned the first page, then another. His expression changed instantly. He turned toward the production crew. Pause the family recognition. The music stopped. The giant screens went black. Within seconds, the celebration no longer belonged to my parents. It belonged to the truth. Mom finally saw me. She froze. For a heartbeat. She looked exactly like the mother I'd spent my childhood searching for. Terrified, not of embarrassment, but of losing her daughter. She hurried toward me. Claire, please, not here. Her voice trembled. We'll talk at home. Home. The word almost made me laugh. I almost died alone, I said it quietly. So no, we won't. Tears filled her eyes. I never wanted this. I know, you wanted silence. Behind us, Ethan stepped down from the stage, looking completely confused. Dad? No answer. Mom? No answer. He turned to Richard. Can somebody please tell me what's going on? Richard didn't speak immediately. He simply opened his briefcase and handed Ethan 3 documents. The amended will, the forged property transfer, the forensic handwriting report. Ethan frowned. This doesn't make sense. He kept reading. His breathing slowed, then stopped. He looked up at Dad. What is this? Dad swallowed hard. It's complicated. No, Ethan's voice cracked. It's not. He lifted the report with trembling hands. Did you forge Claire's signature? Silence. He looked at Mom. Did you know? She couldn't answer. Because the truth had reached the point where words no longer mattered. One reporter stepped closer. Mr. Donovan, is it true your daughter's education savings were redirected over several years? Another voice followed. Were you notified when your daughter suffered cardiac arrest? A third reporter asked the question no one in my family had ever asked before. Why wasn't anyone with her? No one answered. The silence said enough. Around the room, sponsors quietly gathered their folders. One after another, they left. The chairman of the scholarship committee approached Ethan with visible regret. I'm sorry, we're postponing today's recognition until this matter is resolved. Ethan nodded once. He didn't argue, didn't defend anyone. He simply removed the medal from around his neck and held it in his hands as if it suddenly weighed far more than gold. Mom reached for me instinctively, the way mothers do when they're afraid of losing a child. I stepped back. She stopped where she was. Please, I can explain. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. When I was lying in intensive care, did either of you think, just once, that I might not be alive tomorrow? Neither of them answered. Dad lowered his eyes. Mom covered her mouth. For 26 years, they had always found the right words. Now, they had none. I turned toward my father. You spent my entire childhood telling everyone I was the strong one. He still couldn't meet my eyes. I nodded slowly. You were right. I became strong, just not in the way you expected. I looked at Ethan. None of this was his victory. None of it was his fault. I'm sorry, I said quietly. You deserved the truth too. A tear rolled down his face. I would have come. I know. It was the first honest conversation we'd ever had, and it lasted only 3 words. I handed the gray folder to Richard. It's yours now. He understood what I meant. The case no longer belonged to my pain. It belonged to the law. Without another word, I walked toward the exit. No reporters followed. No cameras blocked my path. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, I heard raised voices, questions, confusion, the sound of a family finally collapsing beneath the weight of its own lies. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped asking people to choose her, because I had finally chosen myself. People think justice feels loud, like a judge striking a gavel, like headlines, like revenge. It doesn't. Real justice is surprisingly quiet. Sometimes, it sounds like a front door closing behind you, knowing you never have to walk back through it again. The weeks after the ceremony passed in a blur. News spread faster than I expected. Not because my family was famous, but because people are fascinated by stories that force them to ask uncomfortable questions. How could parents ignore a daughter lying in intensive care? How could a family celebrated for sacrifice be accused of betraying one of their own? Local news stations replayed footage from the scholarship ceremony for days. Comment sections exploded. Some people called me brave. Others accused me of destroying my own family. I stopped reading after the second day. Strangers were arguing over a life they had only seen for 3 minutes on television. None of them knew what 26 years had actually felt like. The legal process moved much slower than the public reaction. There were depositions, financial audits, property records, witness interviews. Richard warned me more than once. This isn't television. Truth wins eventually, but never quickly. For months, I answered questions I'd already answered 100 times. I signed statements, reviewed timelines, read documents I wished had never existed. Some days I left Richard's office feeling lighter. Other days I drove home wondering whether any victory could possibly be worth reliving the worst parts of my life. Healing, I discovered, wasn't a straight line. It never is. About 6 weeks after the ceremony, Ethan called. I stared at his name until the phone almost stopped ringing. Then I answered, "Hi." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. I didn't know where to start. "You don't have to." "I do." His voice sounded different, quieter, older. I read everything, the bank records, Grandma's letters, the reports. Another long silence, then, "I'm sorry." Not the automatic apology people use when they don't know what else to say. A real one. Heavy, uncomfortable. I should have noticed. I leaned against my kitchen counter. "You were a kid." "So were you." His words caught me off guard. I kept thinking about that. You were a kid too, and nobody protected you. I closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, someone inside my own family had finally said it. We met the following weekend at a small cafe overlooking the water. Neither of us mentioned the lawsuit, not at first. Instead, we talked about Grandma, her cinnamon rolls, her terrible singing voice, the way she insisted every board game had house rules. For the first time, we weren't the successful swimmer and the forgotten sister. We were simply 2 grandchildren who missed the same woman. Eventually, Ethan reached into his backpack. "I found this." He placed an old photograph on the table. It showed the 3 of us at the lake cabin. Grandma stood between us with one arm around each of our shoulders. I'd forgotten the picture even existed. "I was cleaning out my apartment," he said. "It was inside one of my old swim journals." I smiled. "You kept it." I guess I did. He looked down at the photo for a long time. You know what's strange? What? I don't remember anyone ever telling me you didn't matter. They just kept acting like I mattered more. There it was, the truth neither of us had understood as children. Favoritism doesn't only wound the child who receives less, it quietly distorts the child who receives everything. The lawsuit eventually ended, not with dramatic courtroom speeches or shocking confessions. Most real cases don't. Faced with overwhelming evidence, my parents agreed to a settlement. The forged transfer was reversed. The lake cabin legally became mine, exactly as Grandma had intended. The funds taken from my education account were repaid with interest. There were other legal terms, other signatures, other consequences. Those belonged to the attorneys. The part that belonged to me was much simpler. For the first time in my adult life, the truth existed on paper. No one could rewrite it anymore. People often ask if my parents ever apologized. The honest answer, yes, several times. Letters, emails, voicemails, even handwritten cards left in my mailbox. Every apology said roughly the same thing. They hadn't realized how much they'd hurt me. They'd been trying to do what they believed was best for Ethan. They hoped one day we could become a family again. Years earlier, those words would have been enough. Not because they healed anything, but because I would have been desperate to believe them. But healing changes the questions you ask. I no longer asked, do they love me? I asked, do I feel safe with them? The answer never changed. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after the lawsuit ended, I drove to the lake cabin alone. The place looked exactly as I remembered. The porch still creaked beneath my feet. The old wind chimes still sang whenever the breeze rolled across the water. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and cinnamon. I spent the afternoon cleaning, dusting bookshelves, opening windows, sorting through boxes Grandma had carefully labeled years before. Near sunset, I found her journal tucked inside the kitchen cupboard. The final page had been folded. I unfolded it carefully. In her familiar handwriting, she had written, "The family you're born into teaches you who you are. The family you build teaches you who you're allowed to become." I sat there for a very long time, listening to the lake, listening to the silence. For once, it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Today, my life looks very different. I still work at Seattle Children's Hospital. Children still struggle to find their words. Parents still cry when they finally hear them. Maria still insists everyone celebrate birthdays. James still brings terrible coffee every Monday morning. Some traditions are worth keeping. Ethan and I aren't trying to erase the past. We're learning how to build something honest instead, slowly, carefully, without pretending nothing happened. As for my parents, I genuinely hope they find peace. Forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. I chose forgiveness because I was tired of carrying anger. I chose distance because I finally learned to protect my own heart. Those choices can exist together. Sometimes I think back to that voicemail. Will come tomorrow. For years, that word defined my life. Tomorrow. Tomorrow they would notice me. Tomorrow they would understand. Tomorrow they would finally choose me. Then one day, I realized something. The person I had been waiting for was never really my parents. It was myself. The day I stopped waiting for tomorrow was the day my life finally began. Because the greatest miracle wasn't that my heart started beating again. It was that I finally stopped giving it to people who had never learned how to hold it. If you've ever been the child who was always told to understand, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, because no child should have to earn the love that should have been given freely. And if this story reminded you that healing is possible, please subscribe and join us for the next journey. We'll be here next week.